In Module 4, you're going to be reading more about the Middle Ages, and it begins with a discussion of the Crusades. So, one thing the book doesn't go into great detail about is feudalism. And I think it's important to just understand that in a very simple way to understand what kind of led to people getting involved in the Crusades. So basically, feudalism was a social system where people fell into a place on this kind of pyramid structure, and they basically stayed there their entire life. So at the bottom, you have like the serfs and peasants, and that was the majority of people. And it works its way up from vassal to lord to king. And this happened during the time, after the Roman Empire fell, and there were all sorts of different tribal barbarian groups basically who took over pieces of that land, and so they had smaller countries with kings at the top of this feudal system. So again, the majority of people were at the bottom. And so I think that's just important for you to understand, because I think the Crusades were very appealing to these people, because otherwise they were pretty much stuck in this life the rest of their life, and they worked very hard and gave most of the profits to the people above them. And so for them, life might have seemed somewhat hopeless. And along came Pope Urban II asking people to get behind the cause of the Crusades. And remember that the Muslims had taken over most of the Holy Land and had moved kind of east and taken over a lot of that land. So it really prohibited access to the Holy Land for a lot of people. And Christians felt the call, like Muslims, to make a religious pilgrimage, and this prohibited them from being able to do that. And so when Pope Urban II asked people to join in the Crusades, a lot of the people who were interested were the lower class peasants and serfs. And again, this was not only a way out of the doldrums of their daily life, but also a very heroic thing to get behind from their point of view. And so we have the Crusades, and when you look at the reading on the Crusades, you'll see that there's a variety of different numbers of crusades that people might indicate, but really it's the first four crusades that we put more emphasis on, and there were other crusades after these four, and some other ones that are kind of interesting, like the Children's Crusade or the Peasants' Crusade, which happened in the beginning. So as you read this, just remember this was fueled by both religious fervor and a desire to take back the Holy Land in the beginning anyway, and also a desire for these kind of simple folk to be able to do something really heroic. And again, I just said that the Crusades started with a good cause, and it was a good cause in the beginning. It did not continue to be a good cause as they fought in the Crusades. It became more a battle for land and power and money, and stealing things from churches that were valuable and things like that. So you'll read about the Crusades. Another thing that you'll read about are some new religious orders that popped up at the time. One in particular that I just wanted to touch on because it's my favorite is the order run by St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis of Assisi is my favorite saint and also my patron saint. But anyway, he lived a pretty good life. He grew up in a wealthy home, and one day he heard a voice saying, "Build my church." And he took that very literally to be God telling him to build a church. So he took some family money and he used it to build a church. And his dad found out he spent this money. So his dad took him to court and sued him. And according to legend, St. Francis of Assisi got so angry in the courtroom that he tore off all of his clothes, and he denounced his parents' wealth and every, article of clothing even that his parents had given him, and walked out of the courtroom naked and went into the wilderness and lived as a hermit for a while. And then pretty soon a lot of people admired the way he was living, and so they kind of formed a monastery. But it was based on very simple living, kind of extreme poverty. And also they were friars, so they believed in kind of walking around and talking to other people instead of just staying in the monastery. But you'll read about some other orders like that. Another important thing that happened at this time is scholasticism. And it's really not accurate to say it happened at this time. I think you could find the roots for scholasticism all the way back to St. Augustine. But St. Thomas Aquinas really perfected kind of the art of scholasticism. And this is really kind of wedding reason and logic with faith and religion. And instead of seeing those as against each other, seeing them as going hand in hand. And recognizing that the supreme being, God, kind of choreographed all of what we can observe naturally in nature and science. So one of the things that Thomas Aquinas did is he wrote something called the Summa Theologia. And in this, one of the famous things that came out of it that your book doesn't really discuss are the 5 proofs of God's existence. We've all found ourselves at times in conversations with people wanting to understand better how you could prove that there is a God. And so in Aquinas' proofs, which are much like geometric proofs, like an inductive sort of reasoning, he uses these 5 arguments, which are on a slide in your notes. The first one is motion, and he's saying something put everything into motion, and so the first mover is God. He says that there's this efficient causes, or this cause and effect that we can observe in nature, and someone had to be the first cause, and so he says that proves that there's a God. Also, possibility and necessity say that we're dependent on so many other things for our survival, that this kind of proves that there's a God, because if you trace all those things that, I'm dependent on a tree is dependent on this, and you keep tracing all of that back, that you can see that we're all dependent on God. He also says that in the degrees of perfection, that we have an innate sense about us, about what is perfect or what we're striving to be, and that the perfect example is God. And then finally, the most convincing argument, in my opinion, is design. And he says if you observe the universe, if you observe just the human body, you're going to see a really intricate design that isn't just formed by chaos, but rather has some order to it and some kind of truths that are happening consistently throughout all of creation. And so someone had to create all of that, and that is God. A couple of other things you'll read about are the medieval Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition, both of which were aimed at rooting out heresies or, again, false teachings. And so you'll read about some of the punishments there, but in essence, the Inquisition, in both the medieval one and the Spanish one, became kind of abused by different people, because all you needed were 2 people to come forward and accuse you of a heresy, and then they would assume that those 2 people were telling the truth. So if you had any enemies, they could simply accuse you of this. You'll read about Pope Innocent III, who was a great pope, and then the Avignon papacy, which is kind of crazy to think about this, but basically, there was an Italian pope who the French king kind of opposed, and then after that pope died, the next pope was a French pope, so the French pope moved the papacy to Avignon, France. The French people were happy with this, but nobody else was, and so the Italians elected a separate pope, so there were 2 different popes, so they called a church council, and they decided, well, the only solution to this is to elect a pope that the council picks. And so at one point there were 3 popes, and eventually the pope selected at that council, Martin V, took over. The last thing that I just want to touch on is the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, which affected Europe in a huge way. 1/3 of the people died, and of course this led to grief all over Europe, and out of this grief was born the Renaissance, which you'll hear about and read about in the next module.